Continuing on in Romans chapter 11. So the Apostle Paul has been talking chapter 9, 10, and now 11 about his deep desire for his fellow countrymen, for the Jewish nation to come to know their Messiah. Last week we were looking at have they stumbled that they should fall? And the Apostle Paul says, certainly not, absolutely no, that he wants to show them what they've lost and to provoke them to jealousy so that they can come and have that relationship with Jesus Christ, their Messiah. And so, is it, as we looked at last week, now if their fall is riches for the world and their failure riches for the Gentiles, how much more their fullness? They rejected the Messiah. Several of them have rejected him. But he says, yes, but a lot of us still have believed in Jesus as our Messiah. So he continues on in verse 15. He says, for if their being cast away is the reconciling of the world, what will their acceptance but be life from the dead? So if they've been cast away, if they come back, it's life from the dead. That same kind of metaphor is something that comes throughout the Old Testament. In Ezekiel, there's the study of the dry bones coming alive. And so you have that same kind of imagery that the Apostle Paul is bringing about the coming back to life. What will their reconciling be? But life from the dead, just as like those dry bones putting on flesh in Ezekiel chapter 37. The hand of the Lord came upon me and brought me, this is from Ezekiel 37, brought me out in the spirit of the Lord and set me down in the midst of the valley, and it was full of bones. Then he caused me to pass by them all around, and behold, there were very many in an open valley, and indeed they were very dry. And he said to me, Son of man, can these bones live? So I answered, O Lord God, you know. Again he said to me, prophesy to these bones, and say to them, O dry bones, hear the words of the Lord. Thus says the Lord God to these bones, surely I will cause breath to enter into you, and you shall live. And I will put sinews on you, and bring flesh upon you, and cover you with skin, and put breath in you, and you shall live. Then you shall know that I am the Lord. So you have the prophesying of the dry bones coming back and putting flesh on. So a very similar kind of metaphor that the Apostle Paul is using here. So if they're being cast away is the reconciling for the world, what will their acceptance be but life from the dead, bringing life from this particular death that they have. He goes on in verse 16, and he says, for if the first fruit is holy, then the lump is holy. And if the root is holy, the branches. So are the branches. So the Apostle Paul is now transitioning. He's going into an agricultural metaphor. And so the title of this message is called Grafted In. And so this past couple of weeks, I've started looking at some of what is grafting, because I don't know about you, but I've never grafted anything. I've never grafted a plant before. So the Apostle Paul is going to go into this metaphor of grafting. So if the first fruit is holy, the lump is also holy. So he's going to talk about different metaphors. He's talking about the first fruits of the plant, the lump, talking about the leaven, if that's holy. If the root is holy of this particular plant, so are the branches. So olives are a very prominent agricultural product around the Mediterranean, where Israel is located, also where the readers of Paul's letter in Rome. There's a lot of olives that are very important food. Particularly when you go over to Israel, there's a lot of things that have olive oil in them. It's a very prominent item. And olives are not just important for food, but also the olive oil is something that can be used as a lighting instrument. So when they're talking about, in the scriptures a lot of time when they're talking about, don't light a lamp and cover it up or anything, they're not usually talking about wax candles the way sometimes you might think of it. They're actually talking about olive oil lamps, which was something that they could put a wick into and then they could light on fire. And so olive oil is 99% pure fuel, which is something I didn't really know, but when I was looking into this, it does not produce smoke or soot and does not burn if spilled. So it's a very good lighting fuel. This one place that I was looking and doing some research on is that olive oil has a low volatile because it has a very high flash point. It won't burn unless it reaches 550 degrees Fahrenheit. So olives are a very, very important part of the culture both of Rome and Israel. And so this is, this is an olive tree. All right, so this is a large olive tree. This is another view of an olive tree, very gangly and everything. This particular one is one that's on the Mount of Olives in a place that's called Gethsemane. This is the Garden of Gethsemane, and there's a whole bunch of olive trees there. So very important crop that's in Israel, also in Rome. This is another image of an olive tree. So olives are a very important crop in the Middle East, in the Mediterranean area. And so the Apostle Paul is going to use this particular illustration of this plant in his next few verses here. So verse 17, he goes on and he says, "And if some of the branches were broken off, and you, being a wild olive tree, were grafted in among them, and with them became a partaker of the root and the fatness of the olive tree." So, as the Apostle Paul has explained in earlier passages, and we looked at it, that some of the nation of Israel had rejected their Messiah. They had rejected it. And so the Apostle Paul goes into this illustration about those branches were broken off. They rejected. There's still branches that are natural to the tree because the Apostle Paul is one of them. He is one of those who is Jewish, that is part of that line. Going way back, he's been talking about Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, talking about that root, a root out of Jesse. The Messiah would come. There's this very much a planting metaphor. So he says in verse 17 that you being an olive wild tree, so talking about us as Gentiles, saying we were clipped off of a wild tree and we were grafted in. So he says, if the branches were broken off, and you being a wild olive tree were grafted in among them, with them, and became a partaker of the root and the fatness of the olive tree. So grafting is a very old practice. Obviously, if Apostle Paul is talking about it, it's been around for a long time. So this is a picture that I got off the internet of some branches that are being grafted in. That are being grafted into this. Turned off there. But anyways, the Apostle Paul is talking about these branches being grafted into the other tree. So the branches are being grafted into this particular other plant. Oh well. You saw what it looks like anyway. But anyways, the things are being grafted back into to this other plant. So he says one of the things that let's see if I can get it back on. I don't know. But anyways, so one of the things that you might have noticed before it went out is that there's like a wrapping that's around it. So when something's grafted in, they have to tie it up with something. And nowadays they might put a piece of plastic, or they might put a rope or string or something around that particular plant. And it keeps it secured in there. So the Apostle Paul is using this illustration of the grafting. And one of the things that grafting is good for, one of the illustrations that I saw online about grafting was with avocados, that you have the really good avocados don't really have a very good root system because they're putting all their energy and all their food supply into making the best fruit. But the ones that have the best root system don't make the best fruit. So they have good roots, but not really good fruit. And so sometimes what they'll do is they'll graft the plants so that the ones that have the best fruit also can have the best root system. And so the Apostle Paul is talking about bringing us in. He says, I'm bringing you into the fold, and so I'm tying you to the branch, which is Jesus Christ, bringing us into that family. In John's Gospel, chapter 15, we see another illustration, which is probably talking about grapes, which is another illustration that you could have with grafting. As Jesus says these words in John chapter 15, I am the true vine, and my Father is the vine dresser. Every branch in me that does not bear fruit, he lifts up, and every branch that bears fruit, he prunes, that it may bear more fruit. You are already clean because of the word which I have spoken to you. Abide in me, and I in you, as the branch cannot bear fruit of itself unless it abides in the vine. Neither can you unless you abide in me. I am the vine, you are the branches. He who abides in me and I in him bears much fruit, for without me you can do nothing. If anyone does not abide in me, he is cast out as a branch and is withered, and they gather them and throw them into the fire, and they are burned. If you abide in me and my words abide in you, you will ask what you desire, and it shall be done for you. By this my Father is glorified, that you bear much fruit, and that you will be my disciples. Very much a key word in that passage there is abide. Abide, 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 abide. I think I counted, and if you go down into verse 10, there's like 10 times that the word abide is used in that passage. But the Apostle Paul is sort of bringing on that same kind of imagery that we are in Christ Jesus. And think about that you have the branches that are tied together. They're literally tied together, and they're secured on there so that they're not going anywhere. We have been tied to Jesus Christ, that we abide with him, that we are a part of him, that we weren't a part of his vine beforehand, but now we've been brought in to Jesus Christ. We have been brought into that. We've been partakers of that root, just as we've been brought in, technically, into the promise of Israel that was promised that there would be a Messiah, and that Messiah would come through. I don't think Grace Fabian brought this up when she was here last year, but one of the first things, and you might have seen it in the book if you read her autobiography, that when the first missionaries came to the Namak people in Papua New Guinea, they didn't know how to speak their language, but they found that the people there used knots for everything that they did. So that when they had a banana plant or something else, they would tie a knot, and they had special knots that they would have on there to sort of mark who owned what plant and different things. And so it was a part of ownership. So what the missionaries did when they really didn't know the language of these people is they took a long strip of red cloth and they put themselves up and they tied this red cloth to another person, and they basically said, as they were trying to illustrate that when we come to Christ, we become part of him, that we're bound, that his knot, we're secured with his knot, and it shows that ownership. And so the New Testament that Grace Fabian and her husband and her children worked on, the Namak New Testament, is literally called God's New Knot, is what the actual translation of the Namak New Testament means, is God's New Knot. And Paul's talking about us being grafted in. And part of being grafted in is having that security from that rope or that string or whatever that's attaching it to the main plant. So some of the branches were broken off, talking about the nation of Israel, those that rejected the Messiah, and then us as Gentiles were grafted in, being a wild olive tree. We're grafted in among them and became partakers of the root and the fatness of the olive tree. We were brought into the vine. Verse 18, Paul goes on and says, "Do not boast against the branches, but if you do boast, remember that you do not support the root, but the root supports you." We were brought into the fold. The Apostle Paul is saying, it's because of the Jewish nation that you are to this point. God's promises were to bring a Messiah. Going all the way back into Genesis, promised to Adam and Eve that there was going to be a seed, but then it came to Abraham. And Abraham, it says, "I'm going to make you a great nation, and through you all the nations of the earth will be blessed." Same thing to Isaac, Jacob, Judah, going down to King David, and all the way down, the Messiah. That is the root. That's our foundation. That's where it goes back to. That's our foundation. That's our root. Don't boast against the branches, the Jewish people that are already a part of that. But if you do boast, remember that you do not support the root. We're just grafted in. We're grafted in there. Jesus Christ is the ultimate root. You do not support the root, but the root supports you. You will say, "Branches were broken off, that I might be grafted in." Branches were broken off. Remember, God's big plan. We don't actually see everything that's working. Why did these people choose not to support the Messiah? Why did they decide not to be part of, to follow the Messiah? The Apostle Paul says they did not believe. But you were grafted in. There was a plan. There was a purpose. Before the foundation of the world, branches were broken off that I might be grafted in. Well said. Because of unbelief, they were broken off. And you stand by faith. Do not be haughty, but fear. When I read these verses here, and I think, I couldn't come up with this kind of plan. God has this master plan, bigger than anything that our imagination could ever have, to actually be able to go into, there we are, plug up, move a little bit there. And we were grafted in. We were grafted into God's plan, brought into there. Just like this particular branch being grafted in, or this other one. You have the smaller plant that's grafted into the root. That's what we were. We were grafted into God's plan. The dry bones came to life. The root is holy. The branches are holy. And we were grafted in. Branches were broken off from that natural root, from that natural olive tree, that we can be grafted in. The Apostle Paul has looked and says, back in earlier in chapter 11, where he says, "I say then, have they stumbled that they should fall? Certainly not, but that through their fall, to provoke them to jealousy, salvation has come to the Gentiles." We've been brought in. We've been brought into this very special family, the family of God. The Jews were meant to be a light to the Gentiles. They were meant to proclaim to the nations. The Messiah came, Jesus came, died on the cross, was buried, rose again. And he is the true vine, the true one that we are grafted into. His plan is beyond anything that we could imagine or comprehend, but he brought us into his fold. The olive tree. Good for food, good for oil that was used for anointing, good for lighting. Good for everything that was there in that area. And we were brought in because of God's master plan. Verse 21, Paul goes on and he says, "For if God did not spare the natural branches, he may not spare you either." About the olive tree, the wild olive tree. Does it mean that you're going to lose your salvation? No, he's not talking about that. But he's saying, don't boast against the root. Therefore consider the goodness and severity of God. On those who fell, severity, but towards you goodness, if you continue in his goodness. Otherwise you also will be cut off. The Gentiles as a whole. God has a plan. Paul doesn't want you to be afraid, but he also doesn't want you to be haughty and boastful. He says the nation of Israel was going down this path. They became haughty. They said, hey, we're the favored ones of God. They were boasting in their laws. Hey, if we are circumcised, if we memorize the word, if we do this, then God will show favor for us. It blinded them to the truth. It blinded them to the knowledge of the Messiah. We've seen it over and over again as we've looked at it. The Apostle Paul, he was blinded to it. He was blinded to the truth. Until the day that he was physically blinded, he finally saw the truth. Consider the goodness and severity of God. On those who fell, severity. But towards you, goodness. If you continue in his goodness. Once again, God's master plan. We've looked at the idea of the puzzle piece. I don't know God's master plan. I don't know what his final picture is going to look like other than what we see in the book of Revelation. He has a plan that each and every day he's working in each and every one of our lives. Consider the goodness and severity of God. Those who fell, severity. Those branches that were broken off, that we could be crafted in. So that's goodness for us, because God says, I want you, and so I'm going to make a way and graft you in. Severity for those who fell, goodness on us. Verse 23, and they also, if they do not continue in unbelief, will be grafted in, for God is able to graft them in again. For if you who were cut off of the olive tree, which are wild by nature, and were grafted contrary to nature into a cultivated olive tree, how much more will those who are the natural branches be grafted into their own olive tree? So once again, this metaphor is saying, hey, those branches that were broken off that Paul's just talked about, how much more easier will it be for those to actually be grafted back in to the same plant that they actually were cut off from? I mean, those branches, there's no difference with them. They're the same thing, being grafted back in. So the Apostle Paul is saying, hey, we as Gentiles, or Apostle Paul wasn't a Gentile, but, to his audience, Gentiles, we were wild by nature, a wild olive tree, and we were put into this domesticated, this well-cultivated olive plant, this olive tree. How much more so will they be able to go into their own olive tree that they came out of? We have so much to be thankful for. The Apostle Paul is saying, don't be haughty, but fear. Stand in awe. What lengths that God went through from eternity past to bring us into his family. That while he was praying there in that garden, as it's there in John's Gospel, as he's praying in that garden before he goes to the cross of Calvary, that soon after he talked about the true vine, verse 20 of chapter 17 of John's Gospel. I do not pray for these alone, but also for those who will believe in me through their word, that they may be one, as you, Father, are in me, and I in you, that they also may be one in us, that the world may believe that you sent me, and the glory which you gave me, and I have given them, that they may be one just as we are one. I and them, you and me, that they may be made perfect in one, that the world may know that you have sent me, and have loved them as you have loved me. Father, I desire that they also, whom you gave me, may be with me where I am, that they may behold my glory, which you have given me, and for you have loved me before the foundation of the world. O righteous Father, the world has not known you, but I have known you, and these have known that you sent me. And I have declared to them your name, and will declare it, and that love which you loved me may be in them, and I in them. Because of that love, that even from that time, is Jesus praying in the garden, praying for his disciples, praying for those who will come afterwards. We are the ones who came after them. Because of the testimony of the apostles, the ones the apostles taught, the ones that those people taught, down and down and down 2,000 years. So that we, who from eternity past, as Paul wrote earlier, from whom he foreknew, he also predestined to be conformed to the image of his Son, that he might be the firstborn among many brethren. Moreover, whom he predestined, these he also called. Whom he called, these he also justified. Whom he justified, these he also glorified. Grafted us in from eternity past. Knew that us as a wild olive tree, as Gentiles, would be part of his magnificent story. God has a plan for each and every one of us. He's had it since before time was time. And he knew that we'd be part of his olive tree, that we would be grafted in. So don't be haughty, but be thankful for what he's done for us. Let's pray. Dear Heavenly Father, I thank you, Lord, that I have been grafted into your vine, grafted into the olive tree. Lord, I'm not a farmer. I don't really understand exactly how it all works on the natural level, but I thank you that you've brought us into your family. The Apostle Paul uses metaphors throughout Romans of adoption to olive trees. Certain illustrations would get other people's attention in different ways. And I thank you, Lord, that you've brought us into your family, that you've brought us into the fullness. Help us not to be haughty. Help us to not be self-arrogant, that we are proud to be a Christian. We should be humbled that you have chose us to be one of your children, humbled and thankful that you've brought us into the fold. And Lord, when we do get pruned, as you spoke about in John's Gospel, chapter 15, pruning us helps us so we can bear more fruit for you. pruning can be painful, but ultimately it's for our own good and it's for your glory. Help me, Lord, help each person here that's part of our church family to continue to grow in you, to bring honor and glory to your name. In Christ's precious name I pray. Amen.